Hello and welcome back, everybody. It is Software Developer Reacts to Silicon Valley, Season 1, Episode 6, which is crazy. I didn't expect the awesome response that you all have given from Episode 1 all the way through Episode 5 so far. I do apologize for being so delayed on this one. Life has been very crazy, what with the holidays, and then there's been some work stuff, and then there's me starting a company that is slow roll growth, but I got a whole strategy for that stuff. Regardless, it has tapped into my time and there's been a whole lot of stuff going on. So I apologize, but I'm here for this one at least. Hopefully it won't take me this long to get to the next episode. I'm also working on a new setup. You may have noticed that my camera is a little bit different than you've seen in other episodes, maybe a little bit sharper. I did upgrade my camera. I got a great deal from a friend of mine who does not use this camera or has not used this camera a whole lot. So they were happy to part with it for a very, very wonderful price for me, which I really do appreciate. That said, I've delayed and I've gone on and rambled for over a minute, and I apologize. Let's jump into the episode and see what episode 6 has for us in the realm of technology.
Kidney function, liver function, testosterone. I don't know how you did it, but you have essentially aged 40 years in the last 7 weeks.
Wow, really?
We had a meth addict in here this morning who was biologically younger than you are, and he's 58. MySpace guy. So what is going on?
This is cloud service configuration. I've been stuck on it for over a week.
Wow.
I'm a good programmer. I mean, it's the only thing I am good at. I mean, last year I threw a frisbee and I chipped my tooth.
Well, that's more of a dental issue.
Yep. Okay, the point is, I learned Ruby on Rails over a weekend when I was 17. I should be able to learn cloud. I have to.
May I give you my professional opinion?
Learned Ruby on Rails at 17 in a little over a week. So Ruby on Rails is a programming language and framework. The programming language is Ruby. On Rails is a framework that allows for a lot more development capability with Ruby. Basically a bunch of prepackaged functions and capabilities that empower you to do more of the development that you intend to do and less of the learning side of things. So that's important because learning a new language in software engineering is not a small feat. It takes quite a bit of time to get used to syntax and methodologies. And at 17 years old, I don't know how long he had been programming for at 17 years old, but honestly, any time that you're learning how to do something brand new, if you can do it in a little over a week, that's pretty impressive. When you look at the long run of other skills that we have as human beings, like walking, managing to eat with a spoon, it's not undoable. It's not a ridiculous amount of time to learn Ruby on Rails. It is a crash course. I'd be curious how many hours per day he was putting into that, because usually when you are talking about being able to do something like that, it's meant to be more of an impressive thing. Like, yeah, I poured in the hours over the course of a week and a half, and I'm brilliant because I can do that in that time frame, but also it was a lot of work to get there. And if there was not a whole lot of work that went into it, you're either a giga genius or you are lying. Regardless, I'd be interested to know how many other programming languages he was familiar with prior to Ruby on Rails, and frameworks for that matter, because some of them aren't incredibly difficult to jump into. Python is relatively easy to jump into. I've only worked with Ruby a couple of times. I worked with a guy also named Steve at one of my previous jobs, and he was a Ruby on Rails developer primarily before he got into the .NET Windows ecosystem, if you can call it that. Kind of is, kind of isn't. But anyway, and from what I saw of him working with it, it didn't look like it was too bad to work with, but it's still learning all new syntax.
Outside help? No, we're not getting any outside help.
Well, it's a week until TechCrunch, Richard. We can't wait any longer.
Richard, look at the board. Okay? Cloud architecture is just a giant turd that is clogging up our pipes. We have to call in a plumber to fix it.
Okay, I hate that metaphor, but Erlich is right. Skillful.
I don't hate that metaphor. It's a fairly solid metaphor. I don't like the idea of having a deadline in a week and pulling somebody else in, because not only do you have to then spin them up on all of the history of the project thus far, which it's possible that there's quite a bit, considering he's been working on this for quite some time, or at least they've alluded to that. But it's always going to take time to spin up a new developer, get them the context and the decisions, and then have them adhere to your code quality definitions, which I'm guessing Richard and the rest of the team have absolutely zero standards documented or written down or anything. That's not uncommon for long-running devs anyway, but especially in a startup scenario where he clearly doesn't know what he's doing for a business. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't have any of that written down. Outsourcing is not a bad thing. Outsourcing is not a good thing when you're in the middle of a crunch time deadline situation when it's this close. This is really a sink or swim moment that, because it's the show, maybe they'll bring it forward and he'll shine and somehow get it to work. But I have a feeling that the storming part of team building and project management is going to take over until like the last day, and then he's going to be some kind of wizard and make it happen, which is completely unrealistic. You can set up a cloud environment in less than a day, but if the cloud architecture side of things includes deployment, CI/CD, automated testing, anything like that, security, and certificate issuance, some of those things can take several hours. Most of the time, certificate issuance is really quick, but it depends on which registrar you're going through and things like that. So it's not enough time to spin them up. It's not enough time to spin them up, get this all built out, and then it's not enough time to do those two things as well as have a regression, which is going back after a release or right before your release and making sure all of your code changes being rolled into release are satisfactory.
And I finished the distribution services days ago, and we're just sitting around waiting for you.
I can solve it.
Richard, you're a fucking rock star, okay?
I want to know
You
what the
just don't
problem
know
is.
cloud. This tiny little shitty area, which is becoming super important, and in many ways is the future of computing. That sort of went south on me, but you understand what I'm saying.
I've already talked to Peter Gregory about insourcing a consultant. I've made contact with a programmer whose cloud architecture is supposed to be insane. They call him the Carver.
The Carver? That Black Hat guy who apparently hacked into the Bank of America and took down their entire system? That the Carver?
We should get him if we can.
So ethics aside, although we don't use the term black hat hacker or black hat programmer anymore, really, you'll still hear it around, but it's not super common. A black hat programmer is somebody that breaks laws or does unethical things in order to breach systems and find and exploit security flaws in systems. If they're talking about hiring somebody that was once a black hat hacker and is now what was called at the time a white hat hacker, then I could see it. A white hat would be the exact opposite of a black hat in this case. Think spy versus spy. Although one is supposed to be more ethical and law-abiding and so on, they go in legally at the request of corporations, organizations, and entities and attempt to find the security flaws so that those businesses, entities, and organizations can then improve their security to prevent those breaches. All right? So if they're looking at hiring a white hat hacker, that I can get behind. Still time frame caveat, right? But I could get behind that. If they're talking about hiring a black hat, then I am nervous that they're going to run into the same issues or similar issues to what they did with Chewie with the artwork, right? So don't look to hire black hat hackers unless they decide to go the ethical and legal route. It is a bigger security flaw to introduce them to the system and say, yes, please come in, free reign, tell us what's wrong with it, because they could go through and introduce more backdoors. They could report some backdoors and not give them to you. A lot of hacking is social engineering. It's actually manipulating people rather than the actual technology.
Okay, we can talk to the guy, but I mean, he's really gonna have to sell me.
No, he's not.
6 months ago, these guys had $35 million in Series B financing. Now, the Carvers here are doing teardown.
He's basically moving the...
I also despise that nickname That's such a Hollywood thing to give him some sort of weird nickname. Maybe that's his username from freaking RuneScape or something like that. I don't know, but that sounds like an edgelord, meme lord, redditor kind of deal. Like not all redditors, but you know what I mean.
The carcass to the cloud.
Don't touch anything. Failure is contagious.
Failure's contagious, huh? And you're looking to hire this guy?
Yeah, people refer to me as the Carver, but no one actually calls me that. It's what people call a screen name. You know?
Yep.
I'm Kevin.
Okay, Kevin. We're from Pied Piper. We spoke earlier.
Yes, you guys are fucked, huh?
No, we're not fucked.
Yes, we are totally fucked. We have a live demo in 1 week and our cloud is in the shitter.
That's
I'm not a fan of having this meeting in an open space with a bunch of construction workers around. Not necessarily anything against construction workers, but having anybody in and around this meeting. This show has a habit of putting these very important meetings in these open spaces. Usually these would be conference room calls. You'd do a rental space, or you would have some sort of video call. Although with a cloud black hat or something like that, I could totally see why they would be concerned about potential security risks with video, because that's a thing. But I don't like that they have all these meetings in the open space. That said, my immediate concern is that this individual looks incredibly young. Maybe they are a prodigy. Maybe they are incredibly talented. Do not do what you did with Guilfoyle and have him be hired illegally. If he turns out to be 17 or 16 or whatever, there are very strict laws in the United States about hiring individuals below the age of 18 and how young of a person can work for how many hours and so on and so forth. So I would be really, really hesitant to jump into a professional relationship with this individual unless it's some sort of contract work and they've started their own business, but I'm not overly familiar with the laws there. So just be aware. I don't like this.
accurate.
Wait, are you Richard?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, your algorithm is solid. It's really good schema.
Okay.
I don't like the
I didn't think
suggestiveness.
you'd be younger. And what are you, 25?
I'm 26.
Yikes.
Okay, so we have a bit of a timeline there. He was 17, so 9 years prior, he had learned Ruby on Rails in just over a week or something like that, right? It's pretty impressive. To get to where he is now, it does kind of lend credence to the fact that he's a genius. Black Hat Hacker is saying that the algorithm is solid. Great. That's good stuff to hear. He should be accepting that gracefully, not downplaying it.
So I have a Model UN thing on Monday, but maybe I could burn through your gig over the weekend.
You think you can do our whole job in 2 days?
I know I can do it in 2 days. I pound Mellow Yellow, Oreos, and Adderall, and I don't sleep until I'm done.
Okay.
But you know what? I also have an offer to do some migration to Gitawonk this weekend. It's kind of chill, and frankly, their tech's a little stronger.
Whoa, what? You think Gitawonk's tech is stronger than ours? I'm sorry, I don't remember reading in Pando Daily that Gavin Belson and Peter Gregory were fighting over Gitawonk. No one offered $10 million to acquire Gitawonk.
Yeah, I agree with Richard. You should come work for us. What's it gonna take, a blowjob? Because Richard will suck the dick right off of your pelvis.
Now you make me laugh, Shaggy Man. All right, I'm in. See you guys Friday.
That's not good enough. Sexual innuendo is a problem here because this individual has come forward and said that they have a Model UN thing. Now, granted, the last time I heard about Model UN, I was in high school. I don't know what the age limit is, if there is one for Model UN. I don't know if it extends into college ages. Maybe he got held back a grade for whatever reason. I don't know. But the fact that he's talking about Model UN is a red flag to me that would indicate that he would be under the age of 18 or just turned 18. That's concerning. And the fact that they didn't follow up, they didn't ask for a driver's license, they didn't ask for certification, they didn't ask for any of that. I don't know if they're 1099ing him, which would be a contractor or a self-employed payment structure. So they would spend this money to him and he would pay for his own taxes or whatever, or if they're W-4ing him to get his tax information so that they can render those taxes through W-2s and such. I don't know what the legitimacy of this is. That's if they're going the legal side. If they're going the illegal side, cash under the table, things like that, him being a high school student is the least of their worries. But yeah, I would be concerned. Also, don't abuse Adderall. It's part of the reason why we have a shortage. I'm not going to get into the tinfoil hat conspiracies here, unless you really want me to. But there is a crisis of stimulants for treatment of ADHD where most of us can't get a hold of our ADHD meds half the time or worse. So don't abuse Adderall. And also it's really bad for your health to do that and just not sleep. You'll definitely shut something down. And if it's not your body, it'll definitely be your mind. People go on mental breaks from that stuff.
Hello, Kevin. Okay, Richard, I just need you to approve Kevin's fee. I got Ehrlich to sign, and you just sign right there.
$20,000 for 2 days.
You know who else thought my price was too high? BitRaptor.
Who?
Exactly.
Great. Peter Gregory.
That was actually a really good comeback. $20,000 for 2 days. It's a lot of money. That's an absurd amount of money in most cases. Out of the, I think it was 300,000 that Peter Gregory gave him. That's not an insignificant percentage. I'd be concerned about that, and I'd be really concerned about just letting a stranger that I don't know into my code base. So one of the big things that I would absolutely do is I would create a fork of my Git repository, which is essentially a copy of the Git repository, the code base that is non-canonical. Allow them to do all their work on that fork, and then allow them to run that through review. So they don't have access to merging that in without solid review systems and things like that. They can't overwrite things. I'd be making sure that I'm locking my computer or taking my laptop with me wherever I'm going, things like that. I would be very, very careful around this individual because I don't know them. Not because of age, not because of race, gender, or anything like that. People are people. It's purely because I don't know them, right? So a branch in your Git repository, you could absolutely do as well. As long as they don't have the ability to merge it in and they don't have administrative access to the Git repository or the source control system. If you give them a fork, they can do all their branching and merging and everything. And if you find that there is a malicious intent behind anything that they've written, or there are major security vulnerabilities for any reason, you can ditch that fork, or you can pull their code in and then patch that before you merge it into your primary code before release, right? So that's the way that I would approach that. I'm loving that we're actually talking about tech in this episode. Weren't they also just worried about money? Like they were just talking about how they couldn't afford Chewy and stuff like that. This is kind of a necessary expense, but also I'd be a little bit more concerned, right? And I'd be more okay with it if they were paying the bill partial up front and then partial on completion of the job and proof of function. Looks like a Google streetcar. Okay, remote control. Yep. Oh, yeah, driverless. My brain, for some reason, went to remote driven.
Hi.
So he's going to get into a big situation here, right? What is it, running on like Apple Maps or something from like, well, I guess it would be period for this, but yeah. Long-winded rant, as I am probably going to be well known to you all for. I don't trust self-driving cars. I've been a software developer, engineer, whatever you want to call it, for over a decade. I know the shortcuts that developers take when they are under the wire, when they are sick of their job, when they are tired, when they are burnt out, when they are overworked, whether it's self-imposed or externally imposed, all of that stuff. I don't care if it's AI. I don't care if it's manually coded rulings and image detection. I don't care if it's driven off of a global positioning system or anything like that. I don't trust self-driving cars because I know developers. I know what corners they cut, what shortcuts they take, what they do to just get something out there so that their boss isn't breathing down their neck or lighting a fire under their rear end. I don't trust the self-driving cars and all of the millions of variables that have to be taken into account when you're dealing with driving. I have no doubt that Jared is going to run into a very significant issue with this.
Ask Guilfoyle for a Danish, and maybe you misheard her?
You're probably right. She just wanted to fuck a Danish.
Wait, you just...
I mean, there are people with jars of peanut butter and copious amounts of other things. So, maybe. Some people are into food.
build all the indexes on the fly?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, well then what's that?
Key value store. Tuples. Speak English.
Okay. He mentioned a key value data store. All kinds of different things can be data stores. It's just a way to hold on to information. Key values refer to two values stored related to one another in what is essentially one record. If you think of something like an Excel spreadsheet, you have two columns. You have one that is your key, one that is your value. So you would be able to look things up by the key and grab the value from it based on that key. In .NET, we use things like key value pairs. You can use arrays. You can use lists of key value pairs. You can use dictionaries, etc. It's not that big of a deal. I don't have any problem with key value pairs in very specific situations. I have a bone to pick with the use of tuples. Tuples can be a very useful thing, but they are, when they are avidly used, they are overused and underdocumented. So what is a tuple? I'm going to refer to all of this in the .NET language because that is my specialty. Other languages, the syntax and the reasoning may differ or vary. In C#, we would see a tuple written as an open parentheses, a variable value, a comma, a space, another variable value, or sorry, a variable type for those two, and then in close parentheses. This essentially means that you can, instead of outputting one value, you can now output two values. You need to make sure that you have some sort of documentation around the use of the tuple because it's a generic way of being able to output two values rather than, or two or more values technically, rather than a singular value. I'm not a fan of this in most cases because the proper architectural decision would be to, in object-oriented programming, create a new object, a new class, a new essentially data transfer object of some sort, where it has the properly named variables of your data that you are putting into that, and then has methods on top of it or below it or whatever, methods within that data transfer object class that can then be accessed via named variables, rather than in C#, if you try to call a method that returns a tuple, you then have to do the resulting variable or the output of that method dot item 1 or dot item 2. And the ambiguity of that in readability makes it more difficult to parse what things are intended for. Now, certainly you can go through and read it and usually get the syntax, or you might be able to. However, you can run into issues if you have a tuple of object, comma, object, or dynamic, comma, dynamic, or T, comma, T, if you're using generics. That becomes a much more difficult thing unless there is a hard cast. And if you're doing a hard cast, that's fine, except why didn't you just create the object in the first place? Doing a hard cast actually will take more resources at runtime than if you were to use the hard typed or the statically typed variable on an object over the use of a tuple. This is incredibly technical when we start talking about resource management and casting and things like that. It's not going to be a significant amount of memory per time, but if that's in a loop, if that is in a hashing algorithm, if that is in anything of that ilk, you're going to run into the potential for, hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands or millions and so on of operations and calls against that casting. And when you do that, you are exponentially increasing the amount of resources that you're using where you could have just left it as a statically typed object. This is a code smell, is what we refer to it. It's sign of bad coding. It's a sign of improper architecture, improper coding that could lead to tech debt and problems moving forward. So I'm not saying that he's misusing a tuple. I'm saying that there are better ways to solve your problem in most instances than using a tuple. I would prefer somebody have a method or a function that returns it would be a function that returns a value, and also has an out variable, which again looks like this. So in C# or in VB.NET, you can do a try parse, which goes through the operation of trying to convert something like a string value, like text, to a number, like a decimal, or a monetary value, or an integer, or whatever, right? So you would do try parse, pass in your string, comma, pass in your out variable. So that would say we're going to run an execution, or we're going to execute on this string. We're going to try to convert it over to a number. And if we are successful, we don't run into any errors, we don't run into any problems, we're going to return a Boolean value, a true or false. In this case, we're going to return true because we were able to successfully convert the string to whatever our number value type needs to be. And then the out variable would then be the variable result of it. We're talking about conversions and talking about casts, which is taking one item or one variable and converting it into another. And that takes resources. That takes extra memory, takes extra computing power. It takes extra work on the computer's part to do that. And while a one-off is probably fine, doing that over and over and over again in a while loop, a for each loop, things like that, can become degrading to the performance, especially in a cloud architecture where you have the potential for realistically 30% of the population of the globe might be accessing this product at the same time, and therefore we would be running that operation upwards of 30 million times in 1 second or 5 minutes or 2 hours. What is your system capable of handling? There's my rant. There's my full bore conversation about tuples.
You doing okay there?
Yeah, fine. Just, this big orchestration stuff, a lot of moving parts. Nothing you need to worry about. You just focus on the cloud.
I'm here if you need me.
He does seem, if he's doing this holistically and he's doing this properly, this is awesome. And he seems to not be a jerk when he's in the middle of his coding. I don't know if it's because he's tired or if he just had a bit of a front because it was a meeting with people he'd never met before. But so far, yeah, I give him props. I still don't trust the fact that we don't know if he's an ethical hacker now or an ethical coder at this point. We also don't know his age, and all of that bothers me still. I would be very concerned. Keeping an eye out.
What is this? Did you overwrite the data schema? Why would you do this? You don't ever do this.
That's exactly what they said when I was working at B of A.
Working at B of A, I thought you hacked in.
No. I was a consultant at the retail banking services and crashed their entire system. It took a team of 7 engineers more than a week to comb through all the code and find my mistake. And the only way that I ever avoided being sued was by agreeing to never tell anyone that I worked there.
In this case, the first thing I want to say is earlier in the episode, I said, don't abuse Adderall and don't do what he was talking about doing so that he could stay up all night doing this stuff or whatever. And it's because it results in this kind of thing. A mental break is not a joke. It's not silly. It's not funny. Even in a hyperbolic portrayal like this, it's not funny because it's a very real thing. Second of all, when you hyper-focus and you're looking at somebody's code and you don't fully understand it, it's very easy to say, well, I know better. I know a better way. I'm not going to take the time to try to understand what they did. I'm going to do it better, faster, easier because I know this way. Well, in reality, that line of thought of I know better in this kind of instance is not necessarily the case. There are oftentimes considerations that other developers have made that have led them away from a certain approach or led them away from a certain feature set or package or what have you. And if you don't have that information, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of using something that they chose not to because of very specific reasons or very serious reasons. In this case, we're talking about a rewrite of a whole data scheme or data schema, if I remember correctly. And that basically is the objects and the way that data is transported from a database or a data store through the application, or at least to an entry point of the application where it's no longer managed by the data engine, it's now managed by the code and the logical classes and functionality that you've written that processes and munges, M-U-N-G-E-S, munges that data. And when you completely alter how data is loaded into the system or how it transports through the system, it can lead to a very significant issue. One of the ways that we mitigate this kind of alteration is we create either an API, an application programming interface, I think is what it stands for, or an SDK, a software development kit. And that essentially gives you a gate that says somebody can come up and ask for information, but it's on our data systems, our data engine and code that serves up data to say, okay, hold on, I'm going to go grab it. It goes and grabs it after verifying that you're a legitimate user or an authorized user. It goes and grabs the data from the data store, the database, brings it forward in a format that is conducive to consumption, and then hands that data over to the requester if they are legitimate. That would prevent the abuse of the data scheme system for this application. It would not prevent if he wrote the code that consumes that data and the workflow that way. Richard is understandably upset because this is not what Kevin was approved to do. It is on him for not setting clear guidelines of, hey, don't write the code, show me how to get over this one hump or this one problem or hurdle that I'm experiencing. Second of all, don't leave a coder in your code base unattended if you don't trust them or don't understand their workflows, especially somebody so green and new to your organization. Third of all, this harkens back to the rant that I had about using Git with forks and branches and things like that. Had Richard been using a version control system, none of this would matter. He wouldn't need to freak out other than the fact that Kevin burned a few hours, and he would then need to just wipe out those changes in the commit history and then start back when that began. That would allow him to at least go back to where he was when he was stuck and approach a new direction with it. This is a bad situation if he's not using version control. It's not a problem whatsoever other than a waste of time if he was using version control. This would be very mitigatable. So we'll see how this goes. I have a feeling that it's probably going to be some sort of cliffhanger or something along those lines. But Kevin has screwed up. He has lied. And understandably, with legal advice, that can be a totally different thing. It's part of his agreement. He had to lie about that legally, and now the cat is out of the bag. But now Richard has blackmail on him, so he's understandably freaking out and upset. He is probably now out of a position here. I would say that because he has written some of the code or a decent amount of the cloud architectural code, that it would be in good faith that they should offer him compensation or partial compensation based on his original bill for screwing up the code. They should retain some of that back with Pied Piper, but they should pay him for the work that he's already done. As far as actually keeping quiet based on money, that's hush money. That is not legal, I don't believe, at least in the United States. And so that I would just in good faith say, nope, it ends here. I don't care about that. Hiring under false pretenses, whatever, as long as your code is good and it's functional and it's not riddled with security holes, we should be fine. As far as Kevin's past and him formerly working at the organization that has been claimed to have been hacked by him. That's a pretty dangerous position to be in, because now you have absolutely no idea the quality of coder that he is prior to his breaking point.
Richard, you okay?
Dinesh, we may have a slight problem. The carver just carved up our entire platform.
What the fuck?
Yeah. The database layers, the application layers, even the chef scripts are fucked.
Little fucker must have hacked into the DDL tables like.
The database layers, the application layers, even the chef scripts are fucked.
Little.
We may have a slight problem. The carver just carved up our entire platform.
What the fuck?
Yeah. The database layers,
The database layers, that would be the data access layers. So the part of the code that fetches data from the database and formats it, that's what I was referring to as the API or the SDK. That would go out to the database, grab the information, format it in a way that's consumable for a client. The application layers he's about to say at this point, those would be the logic that runs after the database fetch that would munge or alter the data. That would essentially be his feed system for the algorithm that he's building. And that would be logical code. So not just I/O or input-output code, but legitimate logic that alters things. So mathematics or conversions or formatting, things like that. Those would all be in that application layer. Now I'm curious about the next part.
application layers, even the chef scripts are fucked.
Chef scripts are a tool used in Ruby. I'm not a Ruby developer. I'm not going to talk out of my rear about it, but the almighty Google and IBM say, quote, chef scripts, which are called recipes, are made of reusable definitions that are written in the Ruby programming language. Chef recipes that perform related functions are grouped in a single container, called a cookbook. Cookbooks and recipes automate common infrastructure tasks. Unquote. So there you go.
What does that mean? What's wrong with you, man?
Can't focus. I'm out of Adderall.
Yeah, he pounded too much Adderall.
Where's that Jared guy who was getting my refill?
Who takes Adderall anymore?
Half the kids in Palo Alto.
A lot of people take Adderall.
Hey,
Oh, Lord.
any of you guys currently on Adderall and, want to make $50?
That's such a bad idea. Don't do that. Don't do that. Also, this is funny. Possible Guilfoyle STD. I think they're called STIs now. But that brain do really be thinking that way sometimes.
And the regression test
Oh, hey.
is...
Hey! A piece of tech that I do know from their tech stack. They are using Jenkins, which is a continuous integration system. This will absolutely run your tests and verify that they are passing based on your assertions. It will give you statuses, health checks, make sure all of that's happening. That tells me that they're probably using some sort of version control system then. They have regression tests. Yeah, that makes sense. Auto refresh, that's fine. All of that looks good. Ingestion engine, compression engine. Those are bunk test names. Those might be test suite names, but they wouldn't just be test names. Typically, you would have tens of, if not hundreds or thousands of unit tests per each. A unit test is meant to be for one method or function. And An integration test would then allow you to verify the functionality between systems. So making sure that this system works with that one and transfers properly. You don't usually run those in automation, or you're not supposed to. A lot of companies do. It's bad for your testing framework because it's incredibly lengthy in some cases, or it can be, and it usually slows down your continuous integration. So building your code, testing it, and then deploying it upon passing a certain margin of error with your tests. So you shouldn't be running integration tests and calling them unit tests. You should be making unit tests that mock external dependencies or nodes that you would push data out to, and so on and so forth, and then keep your testing inside the solution, inside of the project for one project, and each unit test should only test one particular method. Beyond that, as I was saying, this kind of indicates that they're using some sort of version control, because you would push up to the Jenkins server in order to be able to run those tests. And usually you would want that automated. The only way that I could see it working otherwise is if somehow they have it tied to a file directory and they're just copying and pasting files into that file directory, which is a really bad practice. Don't ever do that. Set up a Git repository. It's free. And there are a ton of vendors out there that will allow you to set up a repository for free and make it private so that other people can't see it, insofar as people can't see things on the internet, so to speak, right? Hackers will always find a way to get into something, right? So don't store your passwords in Git. Use environment variables or app settings files that are not checked into Git. Anyway, not the point. Point is, this kind of contradicts they don't have Git, but then I don't know why they'd be freaking out, because maybe they just didn't commit ahead of time. But if we look at the code behind, so I'm looking below the Jenkins in the integrated development environment behind them. They have bintree.java, which is interesting, and they're using a NoSQL database SQL query, which is odd. So a NoSQL database is one that stores documents rather than having relational clauses or relational tables. So typically a relational database would be like an Excel spreadsheet or something along those lines. If you're not a programmer and you know finance stuff, you can imagine it like data grids that you see in QuickBooks or general ledgers, if you happen to be familiar with those kinds of things. They're essentially just grids that you write stuff into. And in that, you usually have each row being one record. Each column represents what that data is. So you'd have one column that is for a user logging into a website. You would have their first name, last name, email address, maybe their phone number, maybe their street address 1, 2, 3, maybe. There's all kinds of different ways to do databases. But that's the idea. Those would be your columns. Your rows would be like John Smith, Jane Doe, so on and so forth, right? And those would be individual people on that table. And then they would also have an ID, an identifier number or string or something like that, that would uniquely identify that record, so you could easily and rapidly look them up, but you could also easily and rapidly reference them in other tables. So you might have a user that has their first name, last name, email address in it with an ID, and then you might have another table that has addresses. And that address table might have your address 1, address 2, address 3, zip, state or province, and then country, so on, right? And by having then another column that is a foreign key column, you can say user ID, maybe it's 1 for John Doe. You can then say that is now bound to the users table for John Doe. So John Doe and this address are tied together relationally. In a document database like NoSQL, which is just a methodology of creating a database or storing data, your NoSQL would store something as an entire document. So like JSON, which I mentioned in the last episode, you would have the entire record of a user in one file or one document that you could then bring forward. These are also kind of known as snapshots, or you can think of them like snapshots of an existing current state of that data at any given time. So That's kind of how NoSQL works. There's a lot more to it, but this is like the distilled version of it. You would not, in this kind of situation, marry a NoSQL database and a relational database together. That would be weird. You don't really run SQL queries or SQL queries against NoSQL unless there's something that I don't know there. I know there are hybrid systems out there, but to have a SQL query run against a NoSQL database seems like it's counterintuitive because you're using kind of the nice, easy syntax of SQL queries against something that would typically use a technology like GraphQL or something else, some other query language. SQL or SQL, as a lot of people call it, it's SQL, but I call it SQL because that's how I learned it. It stands for Structured Query Language. And there are a bunch of providers for that. Microsoft, Oracle has one called MySQL. They also have one called Oracle Database Management System, I think it is. Something along those lines. Anyway, so you have that ability to choose your vendor. And NoSQL also has some Couchbase, CouchDB, Mongo, etc. You can go through and take a look at those. I think Redis, R-E-D-I-S. I think it's pronounced Redis for redistribution or something like that. Anyway, I've heard it Redis, etc. Anyway, it's weird to blend those together for a function, or in this case, an object, because they're newing it up. They have new NoSQL DB SQL query, and then they have parameters, config, values, callback, and then they're returning a client prototype query call. So client object, prototype object, or subobject, query subobject.call this object, and then passing in the query. That could be a visitor pattern where you would pass the current object on. The query result would then populate or hydrate specific values on this object, which would be the current object they're within, or the current instance of the object they're within. The query could then execute through this client prototype query call, render the data or grab the data, and then hydrate the object. The visitor pattern is actually a really nice and powerful one to keep your separation of concerns. That's actually a really great way to do it in most cases. I usually do it through methods that I call contribute data or hydrate data. And that allows me to know exactly what that's intended to do. When you have ambiguous names like call, it can be a little bit more frustrating to go back after 6 months of not working in that code and know exactly what you're dealing with. NoSQL DB SQL PG. I'm guessing PG is page, but I could be wrong there. Equals a new page. I'm going with it. NoSQL DB SQL client. And then module.exports NoSQL DB SQL PG. So you're newing up an object and then setting your module exports. That would essentially be, you would call into that bintree.java, have all of that data rendered, and then that would essentially return it back to whatever had newed up this current object. I believe that's similar to how Python does it, I think, for their file modules or for their code modules. It's been a while since I've been in Python as well. So that's fascinating. And I like seeing that, again, that blend of the two database engines is a little bit weird. It's not something that I'm a fan of, but it's not unheard of. It's just a little bit awkward to imagine writing a SQL query against a database that is NoSQL, because they don't really jive that way. I see a bunch of jars on the side. Those are Java archives. That would be a rendering from Java, kind of like you would see in Windows with an exe, or in Mac OS, you would see something like a DMG file. Jar files are basically similar to zip files or 7z files of different artifacts from the build. I'm seeing that they're inside of a source directory on the far left. Compression. They have a legacy folder, which I'm interested in. That's probably an old backup, which you wouldn't need with Git. You would just create a tag for that specific old legacy code. And then they have Pied Piper underneath that. But Pied Piper only has 3 files. They have a bin tree in window and out window. And I'm not sure why they only have 3 and how large those files are. It looks like the scroll bar, at least on the left editor window, The vertical scroll bar is rather lengthy, so that's not a very long module, which is good. You don't want super long code files if you can avoid it. The other one also looks like the scroll bar is rather lengthy, which means it's a rather short file. That's not bad, but that makes me wonder what... That looks like it's the in window, so I'm curious what the out window would have in it. I love the hello world client.java. Hello world is like this running joke, although apparently newer developers didn't have a hello world program, which I find really sad. Continue the hilarious legacy of the useless program of hello world, please. All it does is print hello world on whatever screen you're doing. But anyway, I'm fascinated by having only 3 files inside of Pied Piper and how they relate to the benchmark, CRC, progress, and solo files that are outside of that. Also, those look like they are C files. The icons look like they are for C development or maybe C++. I can't quite make out the file or the icon that's inside of the blue circle. But if I look in the top of that screen in the breadcrumb, right beneath the little grayed out play button, I'm seeing a C icon, which would indicate that that would be a C file, not a Java file. I could be wrong. Maybe they use that icon separately, but it's definitely closer to Java syntax. Actually, no, it looks... I'm not familiar with Java modules. I haven't really used them a whole lot. I guess if you're watching this and you're a Java dev or you're familiar with Java, do you use module exports in Java? Because that, I don't remember using module exports specifically. That feels more like a scripting language, like I said, Ruby or Python, more so than it does Java. And if Java doesn't support that kind of module.exports functionality, then they're not only blending a scripting language like Ruby or Python in here. This is definitely not Python. This has curly brackets and semicolons, which I think Ruby does as well. But why would it be a Java file? And then, because the syntax looks like Java, except for that module exports, I don't know about that. It's marked as a C file. That's weird. That's all really weird. But it's Hollywood, right? I like to see escape clauses, but I'm seeing public void read block throws IO exception. That's basically if there's an error accessing a file, that it will throw an exception or throw some sort of error that we can consume as a developer. I'm seeing if _stream end was reached and then return. That's called a bailout clause or a preemptive exit or a short circuit. And that helps you reduce nesting to make sure that you are keeping your code relatively clean. Those escape clauses are way nicer than having like 7 if statements nested. What I don't like is then I see a while true underneath that, which then has an if statement. If you have a while true, first of all, you've got to have a way to break out of it. So I hope there's some sort of keyword that says break under certain conditions. But if that were the case, why wouldn't you just have an external variable that you could flip to false when you're ready to exit the while loop? I don't like those indeterminate, infinite loops of while true. And without seeing the further syntax, I don't see if they have escape clauses. I'm going to assume benefit of the doubt that they do. I don't like seeing while true. I would rather have that be a variable that I can control within the loop. But the bigger problem I see is the if size == 0 return. They have that if statement there, and it's only one line nested there, which I think is more of a C# syntax thing, which is weird to see C# blended in there, because this could all be C# except for that module.exports issue. That's weird to me. Anyway, having that if nested in there, I would rather see all of that stuff inside of a separate method, so that my read block method does one thing, but it calls another method. And then that can call whatever methods it needs to. So I'm basically distilling down each method into one reusable block of code that I can easily test. And if I can test that, I can verify that it's going to work across the board, theoretically, right? So that's all valuable stuff. I'm seeing also the client.prototype.query.call is a fully qualified name that tells you the exact call chain and object chain to get to that method back on the left editor there. But I'm also seeing at the top of that a query.call. I would be interested to know what the difference is between client.prototype.query.call and query.call. And if they're the same, then you should be using an alias or you should be using common naming structures. You shouldn't be changing them because it leads to confusion. And if they are different, then you shouldn't be using the same name anyway. You should be using a very specific other name that indicates intent behind the use of that object, if that makes sense. So overall, I give this tech here like a C. If I'm going for purely like effort, like selling it for a quick glance, this is great. This would be an A for effort, but I would give this I'd actually probably give it closer to a C minus for accuracy, mainly because the syntax doesn't match up with the iconography for the tab, the C, and the file extension. There are only 3 files under Pied Piper that the 2 that I'm seeing don't look like they're very long. I don't know what's inside of Benchmark, CRC, Progress, or Solo, and that bothers me a little bit. I also see an IML file, which I'm more familiar with YML, which is YAML code. That's a whole different thing I'm not going to get into right now. But this looks a little bit odd, and maybe the majority of the source code is actually inside that legacy folder for compression or in that range coder, but I'm weirded out by the fact that it's so low in file count. If you have low files and they're doing their job effectively, or a low number of files and they're doing their job effectively, those files are usually really long. And if they are doing the job correctly and there are a bunch of them, it oftentimes can mean that they are much smaller files than they would be otherwise. So I give it a C minus, because it does touch on a lot of the technological terms and it does look like an IDE, and there is code there that does syntactically kind of make sense, but the semantics behind it bother me a little bit, and it's a little bit awkward, let alone the question about whether or not they're in source control or not. So,
Your mom?
Oh, by the way, you owe me $20,000.
no.
What a dick.
All right. So, episode 6 down. Way more tech in this one, and I know I talked a ton. This is a much longer episode. I'm going to see what makes sense to cut out and everything, but this might just be a really long one, and I apologize. I'm not going to be able to keep them all within a certain short range. Like, not all of them can be 20 minutes. I talk too much for that. There's a lot of context to bring up. It's not just a reaction. This is a breakdown and analysis. I'm reacting to it. I've never seen this before, but I also want to make sure that I'm offering some value as well. So thanks for joining me on this one. I was much happier to see more tech and be able to talk about that side of it rather than just the business. And a couple of you clued me in the comments in previous videos that there was more tech to come. I'm really excited about that. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know if you want me to keep going, if you want me to continue to make more episodes, and if you have any other shows that you want me to react to, or any other movies or anything like that, feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to take a look and see if it's something that I can do. Thanks all, and until next time, have a good one.